Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to the 28th meeting in 2012 of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee. As usual, can I ask everyone to ensure they have switched off mobile phones and other electronic equipment, please. Agenda item 1 is business in private. It's to consider whether to take agenda item 3 on approach to a forthcoming inquiry in private. Are we all agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Agenda item 2 is the High-Hedges Scotland Bill. We will be taking oral evidence today on this bill. Before we move to the witnesses, I'd like to welcome the member in charge of the bill, Mark MacDonald. As it is the committee's function to scrutinise the bill, we have agreed that committee members will put their questions to the witnesses first. Once that is complete, Mark will be invited to put any questions he may have to the witnesses. So, can I welcome Pamela McDougall and Derek Park of Scott-Hedge, Dr Maggie Keegan, Head of Policy with the Scottish Wildlife Trust, Aidan Smith, Head of Planning and Development with RSPB Scotland, and Angus Yarwood, Government Affairs Manager with the Woodland Trust. Could I ask you if you want to say any brief opening remarks before we move to questioning? Can we start with Scott-Hedge first, please?
Yes, I'd just like to thank Mark MacDonald right at the beginning and his team and the cross-party MSPs who have supported us, and to say that Scotland, as you know, is the only country in the UK without legislation on high hedges. I'm convinced, and so is Scott-Hedge, that deciduous and single trees should be included in the legislation. Other than that, we are really happy with the rest of the bill. We do have total respect for the other organisations represented here. They are, of course, all, and as you are all, paid professionals, and we are the amateurs, but no less passionate and knowledgeable after the past 13 years that we have been campaigning. So we hope to convince you of that.
Thank you. Dr Keegan.
Press that, yes. Hi, I'm Head of Policy at Scottish Wildlife Trust. Scottish Wildlife Trust own and manage over 120 reserves in Scotland. Over 20 of these are in urban areas and contain woodlands. In the evidence I submitted, I've highlighted some of the concerns we have regarding if the bill was broadened out to include deciduous trees. I think we're coming from a biodiversity point of view, and whenever we look at legislation, it's the unintended consequences of bills. So I hope to make those points more clearly during the course of this morning.
Thank you. Mr Smith.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the invite to come and speak to you today. I think most members will be quite familiar with our organisation and what our aims are, but obviously our main interest in this bill is to ensure that birds and wildlife are considered, however it progresses, and happy to take any questions that you may have on what we've submitted on that today.
Thank you. Mr Yarwood.
Thank you for inviting us as well. The Woodland Trust, Scotland, are part of the UK's Woodland Trust, and our key objectives are around creating new woodlands, protecting veteran trees and ancient trees, and people's enjoyment of woodlands and trees in their own right. And our interests here are around trying to avoid the capture of important individual trees, heritage trees and veteran trees, as Maggie points out, in unintended consequences of the bill. And I've got some particular concerns around the tree preservation order interaction with this bill. But again, it's biodiversity and the enjoyment of trees that's our interest here today.
Thank you very much. Can I start the questioning by asking the witnesses for their views of the statutory definition of a hedge as set out in section 1 of the bill? Mr Park.
Good morning, thank you. As Pam said, our concern about the statutory definition of the bill is that it doesn't cover every possible case, so deciduous trees and single trees are excluded from the definition. I think there is a certain amount of misunderstanding, probably in public and certainly within COSLA and maybe wider, that inclusion of deciduous trees and single trees will add wildly to the scope of the bill.
Stop you there, Mr. Park, because I understand that in your submission you said that COSLA were against widening the bill. The clerks have actually spoken to COSLA and they have actually said no such thing. So I think that part of your submission you need to check with COSLA. My understanding from COSLA, though, is that they have no objection to the widening of the bill. But
yeah, well, we just saw that in the policy memo, that there was concern that it would add significantly to the scope and the complexity of the bill. If COSLA now are saying that is not the case, wonderful, we welcome that. That's good news for us. I think people need to understand that just by having a bill, 95 or 92% to be accurate of the cases will resolve themselves based on evidence that we took out of the policy memo of cases in England. So I think people need to understand. I've done a bit of a graphic, if you'll allow me, indulge me. A football pitch, okay? This area represents what we consider to be the total number of cases that there probably are in Scotland, based on the data that we've got for the 6 local authorities in England that was in the policy memorandum. We've taken population figures, taken the 6 typical boroughs from England and projected it onto, if you like, the Scottish situation. So that gives us about 5,000, possibly 5,000 cases in Scotland. The yellow area is all that will remain of the evergreen bills just by passing the legislation. The cases will dissolve. People will start to do the right thing. If you make a 30-mile-an-hour limit, people obey a 30-mile-an-hour limit. You don't need to put a policeman with a speed gun at the entrance to every village. People will start to do the right thing. The red area on there is the difference that it will make if we include evergreen species. And that is based on our data that we've got in Scott-Hedge from our members, and it's also based on the consultation data from the 2009 consultation from here. Excuse me. So that is our view on why the definition will not add significantly to the complexity of the case, and we cover that at great length in the paper. In our submission. Do you want me to go any further with that, or does that answer your question?
I think the paper covers quite a lot of what you have just said there. I wonder if we could move on to Dr. Keegan for your opinion.
In the definition talks about evergreens or semi-evergreen trees. Obviously, evergreen trees do cover native Scottish trees such as juniper, holly and yew, and obviously we consider the biodiversity value. Native trees have evolved after the last glaciations with our invertebrates and other wildlife in Scotland, and that's why they have much more biodiversity value than non-native tree species. So if we have any sort of thought about the bill, it would be that it would probably be better to say non-native evergreen or semi-evergreen trees, because then that would not capture some of our native species or non-native conifers, because you are trying to capture Lelandii and other trees I put in here, sort of western red cedar, which have little biodiversity value, and obviously they're quite fast growing, whereas some of the native ones aren't so fast growing. Anyway, I'll leave it at that for now, because this...
Okay, Mr. Smith.
Yeah, broadly agree with what Dr. Keegan has said there. I think the current definition has the benefits of simplicity, which in terms of administration and management of it, should it be progress, and in terms of its implementation, has got obvious benefits. The current definition as well, as Dr. Keegan has said, generally is likely to mean that hedges and trees, which are broadly, generally speaking, higher biodiversity value, which tend to be native species, are not going to be captured by this. So in terms of our primary area of concern, which is that there won't be an adverse impact on wildlife or on biodiversity, this current simple definition means that there is less likely to be adverse implications for wildlife. There may be other ways of doing that, so a broadening out the definition, I think, would mean that the bill would have to get a bit more complicated, because we would have to have additional safeguards in place to ensure that there weren't these impacts on birds and wildlife. So I think for that reason we're broadly supportive of quite a simple, clear definition as it is currently put forward. It doesn't mean that we would necessarily be absolutely opposed to the definition being broadened out, but I think there would have to be additional safeguards introduced if that was going to be the case, to ensure that there aren't additional adverse risks to wildlife.
Thank you. Mr. Yarwood.
I think I would add to Dr. Keegan that we also support the addition of the non-native phrase into the definition. And the reason for that, again, is around biodiversity, but also around the heritage value. So particularly, for example, a recent case in Fife of a tree which was, a sycamore tree that was 300 years old, that had a tree preservation order in place on it. That's the kind which the local authority were asked to consider felling. Due to concerns for a local house. Those kind of trees are the kind of trees that we're interested in, the ones that have a cultural and historical value. And although we acknowledge that within the bill there is an element suggested for that under the discussion and the assessment of each case that the tree officer would do. We feel that by adding the non-native, semi-evergreen and evergreen into the bill, it just clarifies it for tree officers. And at the moment, they're under a huge amount of pressure under resource pressure to deal with their caseloads. And my experience of working with them and of talking to them is that giving them clarity and giving them a clear framework to working makes their job a lot easier. So we found this with tree preservation orders, which were discussed in Parliament February this year, and that was a consideration for the Rural Affairs and Climate Change bill as well. So yes, for us it's about keeping it simple, keeping it straightforward, and making sure that the people on the ground, the tree officers, have clarity over what they're doing on a day-to-day basis.
Stuart Stevenson, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. I speak about my personal circumstances, but not because I've personally got a concern, but because it illustrates a general point. Living as I do in a rural location, surrounded on three sides by commercial non-native conifers, so dense that I'm unable to receive any terrestrial television signal, and there is significant light obstruction. I knew what I was buying because it was there when I bought the house, so let's just say that. Do you think that commercial forestry of that nature should be caught by definitions used in the bill? And I'm not directing that at anyone in particular.
Well, that could have implications for the Climate Change Act.
Indeed.
And I did put in my submission about woodlands in and around towns. I think one of our concerns is that if it's broadened out, you could get, and we have had an instance where the woodland was there first, and the developers developed houses close to woodlands, because the onus then would be on the land manager of the woodland having to take responsibility and chop down trees, and that's an unintended consequence if this is broadened out. That's my opinion anyway.
Mr. Yarwood, you're dying to come in there.
Just to say that in terms of woodlands and forests, they're covered, as Stuart Stevenson will know, they're covered by the Forestry Act 1967. And as he points out, if you're buying a property with trees already there, then you're aware of that at the beginning. In our position, with our sites, and we manage a mixture of urban and rural sites, we have quite a lot of property around Livingston and Glenrothes. Our experience there is that the only way that we've really been able to solve these issues is through dialogue with our neighbours. Now, I appreciate that this bill is coming around because of this issue, because dialogue is difficult to achieve. But where you've got a woodland or a forest involved, I think that really has to be covered by the forestry legislation, and whether or not that is fit for purpose is a separate discussion. But certainly I wouldn't want to see woods or forests being included in this kind of definition. I think it needs to be maintained to hedges and to boundaries where you've got housing close to each other, and that's essentially the nature of the problem. It's that people are living closely together with a boundary that's causing a problem. If you're living in a rural area where you've got a forest next to your property, you've chosen to live in that place.
Can I just ask, in the context of that answer, you're clearly laying out that you would exclude commercial forestry covered by relevant Forestry Act, but there are other commercial wood-growing activities, particularly, say, for coppicing, that are not covered by these acts. Where would you place these if they were to otherwise fall in the definitions? Would you draw the line at anything that has commercial value being excluded, or otherwise? Or is that something we should explore with a range of other people?
It's not something I have a particular view on. As far as I can see, if you've got a commercial piece of land which is commercially forested, then this dispute is perhaps why it's not really captured by Scott Hedges' concerns, in that it's much like having a piece of farmland next to where you live. My understanding is that the bill is really looking at neighbour disputes and around hedges or trees that cause a problem on boundary lines. For us, no. I mean, that land is wooded and it's covered as such, and if you wanted to change its use, then you have to go to the Forestry Commission for a felling licence and so on.
Sure.
So,
I mean, it might be worth saying one of the things the committee is seeking to do is both to understand the policy intention and then to understand if the bill before us delivers that. Because there may be a mismatch, and that's partly why we ask these questions.
Next, please.
I was just going to say that I think the same thing applies as well to sort of planning regulations. There's been mention in some of the submissions about, developers using these kind of things to get more properties onto a plot, etc. We're talking here about a very specific, relatively low number of domestic cases. In answer to the question about tree officers, we've worked out again, using the data that's in the policy memorandum, that we expect for an average Scottish local authority, there are 32 local authorities, for an average Scottish local authority, we expect between 2 and 3 formal complaints a year over the 7 years, if you like, that it'll probably take. Now, okay, it's probably going to be front-end loaded, but on average, 2 or 3 cases a year. That's all we're talking about. We're talking about a hedge area. If you take that there are 1.5 million ground floor properties in Scotland, roughly, if you take flats and things out and apartments, if 1 in 3 of those has a hedge, that's 550,000 properties. We're looking here at about 5,000 cases. If we add deciduous in or out, if we add single trees in or out, the impact on the total Scottish domestic hedge stock is less than 0.5%. We are not talking here about a huge big undertaking. We're not talking about tree officers going out with theodolites, measuring heights of trees and chopping them down. We're not talking about busybodies going around going, well, there's a 6-foot tree there, or a 6-foot 1-inch tree. We are talking about a complaints-based system when the people who complain are often old, bullied, infirm, disabled, low-income people whose life, frankly, has been made an absolute misery by vegetation.
Mr. Smith, please.
Yes, I was just going to come back on Stuart Stevenson's point. I mean, I think that example highlights some of the difficulties of administration potentially about trying to make a judgment as to when trees or hedges are causing a difficulty. So in that sort of situation, you could envisage that it might be difficult to try and work out exactly what extent the woodland of the woodland is causing the problem. So it could end up being quite an administrative challenge to try and work that out. And I think that is going to be one of the challenges with trying to progress this bill, is to get something which is actually workable. The other point, I guess, in response to that is in that sort of situation where it's a commercial forest, the biodiversity value of that forest is likely to be relatively low, although it may well still have some value. But there are other situations where there may be woodland surrounding houses where the woodland is of a different type and it is of a much higher biodiversity value. And in those sorts of situations, that's where we would be concerned if the scope of the bill was such that it would make it easier for works to happen which would affect that.
dense as this forest is, it has 5 badger sets in 76 acres. It has foxes, it has pheasants, it has a barn owl, buzzards, it has weasels. You know, there's a lot there, even though it's very dense. And the badgers might mean you couldn't cut it down, by the way. Because, again, there would be legislation protecting their 5 sets that are in that forest.
Ms McDougall.
I just want to briefly make the point of we're not talking about chopping down trees and removing trees at all in this bill. We're talking about reducing them to a sensible height. You know? And I don't think that there'll be fewer birds in my garden if the 50, 60-foot Leylandii were cut down to a decent 2 metres. I don't think, because we have all kinds of birds in our garden, and they roost and nest in, 2-metre hedges just as well as they do in the huge ones. So I think it's a bit of a red herring in a sense, although I do appreciate Mr Stevenson's point about badgers and what have you. We have them in Angus too, but they don't nest in our trees.
Dr Keegan.
Yes, I was just going to say, with regard to if you have, say, in a garden a 200-year-old tree, a deciduous tree, it's quite hard to bring that down to 3 metres in height. Unless you coppice it right at the beginning, most trees won't take pollarding when they're that old, so that would be quite difficult. And the other thing to remember is that, older trees do have biodiversity value in that they may provide roost sites for European protected species such as bats. So what you'd have to have is a highly trained tree preservation officer to be able to inspect a tree to see what, if there was a bat root present, and then provide alternative nest sites, because that's what happens if you have a wind farm development and you're going to take down some old trees. You have to do a bat survey. I used to do bat surveys, and I know it's quite difficult to assess if a tree has a bat roost potential.
Okay. Mr Yarwood.
Dr Keegan's covered my points.
Okay. Mr Stevenson, do you want to come back in? Stuart McMillan then, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Sitting with the bill that's in front of us, there is kind of much agreement across much agreement from kind of both sides of the debate. I think that one of the fundamental parts of the bill is something that's been discussed over the last about 20 minutes or so in terms of the definition. Now, in terms of legislation that has been passed elsewhere in these islands, there's been a different definition in some of the legislation. Obviously, this bill has been kind of based upon the bill that passed down at Westminster, but there's the bill that's passed in the Isle of Man with a definition which is different. What of these various definitions, which of these do you think is actually better or preferred from your organisation's perspective, and why do you think that particular definition should actually be introduced here, and what benefits or failings do you think it would actually have if it were introduced here in Scotland?
Someone from Scott Hedge first.
Thank you.
Mr Park.
Yes. Yep, you're absolutely right. England and Wales have a definition. Again, in our paper, that was a pretty second-rate job at producing a definition for various political reasons that I'm not going to go into. The Northern Ireland has something pretty similar, but our preferred definition is the one used in the Isle of Man. The reason for that is that it does offer a wide definition. The wording is about reasonable enjoyment of a property, something that stops, people having a reasonable enjoyment of a property. But that gets the case in play. If you consider that trees, shrubs, hedges, or whatever are affecting your right to a reasonable enjoyment of property, you can raise a case. You'll probably have to pay a fee. It will cost you some money. It's not going to be a frivolous or a vexatious claim. But at least then, the process can start to happen fairly for everybody, and everybody's concerns can be taken into account. Tree preservation officers, all the other people that might be wanting to be involved from the local authority. So we prefer the Isle of Man definition because of that. It just allows all the cases to at least people can make a complaint and their case can be considered. If we don't do that, The danger is, and believe me, we are dealing with some pretty unscrupulous people here, in our experience of the people that are growing these hedges. All that they will do is switch species. I have to go back to the thing about native species. If the native thing is put in, they go down to Dobbies, buy the native stuff. It's already 20 foot high, and they can be just as bad people and cause just as much distress, probably within a few months, as they had when it was the dreaded Leylander. So we prefer a wide definition, but a tight process after the definition. Please don't exclude people from the start just because of some vagary about species.
Dr. Keegan.
Well, I'd just like to say it must be really awful to live next door to, somebody who has those intentions, and we can, I should have said right at the beginning, we can appreciate the misery that non-native, these fast-growing hedges or whatever can cause. I just think that if you broaden the scope, then you do have implications. And the other thing to remember is you could put off people actually planting trees in the future in gardens because of the likelihood that you're going to have to keep them to these heights. So you are decreasing the future biodiversity value of urban sites. Also, as I've mentioned in our evidence, we have had conflict with neighbours in Cumbernauld, where we have seen developments go up after we've had, after woodland's been established, and we're now seeing that neighbours who adjoin our woodland want some of our woodland cut down, whereas if there'd been a big buffer zone created by the developer, then this wouldn't have happened. And I do see one of the unintended consequences that this could happen more in the future. And I think really it's about having the right tree in the right place. And there is guidance on having, smaller trees. There's some Forestry Commission guidance on this. But if local authorities had that to give out to people and to developers, and if urban woodlands and development was more designed around what's going to happen in 20 years' time, we'd have less of these conflicts.
In that kind of situation where a developer has built next to a existing tree line, and I should say that I've come across a situation previously in a former life, a case whereby somebody bought a house next to a playground and then campaigned to get rid of the playground. Do you think that there should maybe be something in the bill which takes account of existing woodland when there is new development?
Well, I think it would help, because quite often we've worked with developers before on master plans. I'm not a reserves manager, I should say. I've spoken to all the reserves managers about this and putting forward the evidence. But we have worked on master plans, and then when it's got down the line, we've got a slightly different development with less of a buffer zone than we've had before. In one of the cases we had at Cumbernauld Glen, what happened was the development went up the same time as the woodland was planted, and we didn't manage the woodland at that time, and they planted larch right smack next door to where the houses were. So 30 years down the line, you've got shading of the houses. We took over the woodland, and the neighbours complained about the woodland, and as it happened, it was larch, which had less biodiversity value anyway. So we were quite happy to take out some of that line of trees. And then what we did was we got a woodlands in and around town grant, and we planted native species further away from the houses and put a shrub line. But that conflict would have been avoided if the developers had had guidance on what would happen in the future, because they put in that tree line to act as a buffer against a nearby road, to abate noise and things like that.
Mr. Smith or Mr. Yarwood, do you want to come in on the different pieces of legislation that exist?
Sure, yeah. So in terms of the definitions, I think as I indicated earlier on, the actual detail of the definition being quite tight has its advantages in terms of potentially producing a bit of legislation which is quite simple, and therefore by its simplicity, if you like, means that there's less likely to be adverse impacts on biodiversity. So I think there are kind of two ways of looking at this. Either we have either go for a piece of legislation which has a tight definition which prevents any adverse impacts on biodiversity, or else we go for a broader definition but have a more comprehensive complicated and rigorous way of assessing cases on an individual basis. The disadvantage of that, obviously, is that it's going to add on additional burdens to this end of the process when individual assessments are happening. And for that reason, we've been relatively supportive of the current tight definition that's there at the moment in the proposed bill.
Thank you. Mr Yarwood.
I would echo that and add that if it was to be a broader definition, then we would want to go back and look at the other clauses in the bill to make sure that we're then, particularly around tree preservation orders and again around the importance of heritage trees and biodiversity value being properly assessed. And I would want to see some clauses in other parts of the bill to make sure that tree officers had the basis in law rather than just in guidance to say this is why we're keeping these trees, and although we might have had an application to deal with a particular hedge, for these reasons, these native species, these biodiversity values are enshrined in the piece of legislation. So open to that discussion, and as Dr Keegan has said, very sympathetic with the situation. My family has experienced this in the past as well, so very aware of the problem, but would just say that if it is to be open, then I think we really need to look more carefully at some of the other clauses in the bill too, and the current small definition allows this bill to work quite nicely as it is, I think.
You said something moments ago about regarding the right tree in the right place. Now, I mean, there will be examples of deciduous trees of forestry species actually in urban areas, in areas where there really shouldn't be. And in terms of what goes on under the ground, they can create even more potential damage under the ground. So I think it was a very interesting point that you raised, and I think it's something that we need to consider. But also, one other point. So in terms of kind of many folk will actually maybe kind of plant seedlings that they've actually maybe purchased through mail order, or they've been given them as some type of kind of gift, and they haven't a clue what they've actually got until them and they plant them, and then things happen. And I've been told an example of this whereby in one area in the west of Scotland last year that a 60-foot populous robusta was cut down and had to be taken out through the close of this particular area. So not everyone actually fully understands what they have, what they've planted, and I think it's your point regarding knowing what you have is extremely important. It's one that we really need to take cognizance of.
I was just going to say, you certainly wouldn't want a giant redwood in your garden because they grow to 100 metres or whatever. But I mean, whether you could have guidance in nurseries showing this is actually what it's going to look like in 20, 30 years' time. The other thing is in London, where they're advocating planting street trees, because don't forget that trees have a value other than just, nice to look at, because obviously they sequester carbon and they slow water runoff, and so they have ecosystem service values. And they give guidance on, where to plant trees, and it would be quite useful if we had that sort of thing, even if in nurseries.
It's not going to come in this bill, I don't think, in terms of guidance. So I'm going to skip this. Ms McDougall, very briefly.
I think we're really getting away from what the bill
That's why
intends.
I'm steering it away. If you've got no comment on that, then I'm going to move to Margaret Mitchell.
I do agree that education plays a huge point in it. I mean, the garden centres are really not interested because they're interested in selling trees. So I just wanted to make that point.
This bill will not do anything.
And guidance. Neither does it cover anything underground. So I think that's out of
that's why I'm moving on. Okay.
Thank you.
Margaret Mitchell.
Good morning, panel. Obviously, the definition is key, and if I understand you correctly, Dr. Keegan, then the Scottish Wildlife Trust's position is that you don't want it extended. You've ruled that out completely, and in fact, you'd like it narrowed a little bit. Others are more open-minded, perhaps, and open to this with certain safeguards. So I put to you, Dr. Keegan, if you're in favour of even a narrow definition, then you appear to have accepted the proposition in section 2.2, which says a notice can be made where an applicant considers that the height of a high hedge situated on land owned or occupied by another person adversely affects the enjoyment of the domestic property which an occupant of that property could reasonably expect to have. So you've accepted there are scenarios there.
Yes.
So knowing, as we do, there could be loopholes and deciduous trees then could be planted where they're not covered by that narrow definition, wouldn't it be a way forward to look at it not so much from the definition and looking more at the Isle of Man, that's the whole ethos of it, but more on protecting the historical, cultural, and I think according to our SPB, if biodiversity was brought into that, there could be a common sense kind of approach brought to it without adversely affecting what everyone wants to achieve from this bill.
Yeah, yes, I can see that. It just requires quite a lot of expertise, and it's having the capacity in local authorities and who it would fall onto, because you do need well-trained experts to assess the biodiversity value of an old... I mean, obviously, if it's an old oak tree, well, that has high biodiversity value by definition. But, you know, if it's got a squirrel dray or if it's, as I say, a bat roost site, you need somebody to really have a good look at that. And what I'm saying is, have we got the capacity to look at this in local authorities? So is it going to fall down to the tree preservation officer or the biodiversity officer? And they're quite hard pressed in their roles. So if they have to go out and do this as well, is that going to do something for biodiversity in other areas?
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I think that's absolutely key to what we're discussing here. Before anyone else gives me their opinion, I really want to hear that. Then isn't there a huge problem about enforcement? And I know in particular the Woodland Trust is concerned about tree preservation orders. In my experience, they aren't worth the paper they're written on. You know, people just cut trees down and say, oops, breached it. So there's a huge issue about the lack of enforcement within local authorities for these kind of issues. And I think that impinges too on the planning regulations that you were talking about, where builders have guidance. Is guidance strong enough? Because clearly it seems to me that that's being breached as well. So some opinions around that would be helpful.
Dr. Keegan, do you want to continue, or do you think...
I should let somebody else on.
Mr. Yarwood, do you want to come in from the Woodland Trust point of view?
Yes, just to say that you're quite right. Tree preservation orders are not uniformly applied across Scotland for various reasons, and we did some research recently around their use over the last 10 years or so, and they have dropped off quite significantly, and there are issues with certainly one local authority in Scotland not actually having the legal documents or not able to find them and lay their hands on them. Most others are much better prepared at the moment, but so there is a big issue around that, and you're right that in certain cases, you know, the penalties are not high enough, and the same with in building regulations, if trees are cut down, the penalties aren't high enough. But that is separate to all of this, and we did the Parliament did look at this in when the tree preservation orders were revised in February, or came in February this year. Last year, 2011. And there are still, as far as I'm concerned, problems with that. And I think, given the way they're dealt with by local authorities and the difficulties that tree officers find on the ground to deal with them, I think having a narrow definition here really does help them deal with the problems that we've got around high hedges, and that if it's a broader definition, we then get into all of the problems around how they assess them and the workload that would place upon them, but also the difficulties, as Dr. Keegan expressed, in reviewing the trees. And I was actually talking to a colleague of mine yesterday who is a site manager in Scotland but used to work in England when the legislation that was brought in there. And his experience was that, particularly with established trees or established hedges which might be evergreen, that even then, if they're to bring them down to the level which is acceptable, they would run the risk of killing the trees in the hedge that the local authority would then be liable for, because they're not in a position to be able to kill the trees. They're there to help control the problem. So his argument was saying that, if you've got very, very tall Elandii or other non-native species, they ran the risk of killing them, and therefore they wouldn't take any action either. So there were so many complications, I think, around opening it up that keeping it clearly defined will help the people on the ground in delivering it.
Isn't there a competing interest, though, on the reasonable enjoyment of property, that this bill is really the very essence of the bill? So it might solve your problem with the TPO, and I can see why you're worried about that. But don't you need to look at the bigger picture and hope that when any particular situation comes before a local authority, they will look at it on a common sense basis and say where's the greater need, more or less?
Yeah, that's the decision they've got to make, and I think it's worth us discussing, which is why we're here, to talk about all the options around that. And it is a judgment decision, and as I've said, we're coming from a tree enjoyment and biodiversity perspective, and as I've also mentioned in my submission, there are other important values to trees in the urban area particularly, and the current planning policy in Scotland tries to embrace placemaking and greening of urban areas for lots of reasons, to do with people's enjoyment of where they live, but also the health benefits it provides, taking pollutants out of the air, providing windbreaks, which also help to reduce energy transfer from properties out into the environment, which all helps around climate change targets. There are so many complications in there, and that is the hard bit, I'm afraid.
McDougall, you want to come in?
Yes, please, just briefly, to say that I wonder if you've considered the health deficits to the people who have to live at the other side of these hedges. Physical health, mental health, psychological health. If you could hear some of the telephone calls that I've had in the last 13 years, we love trees too. Everything you said about trees and the biodiversity, we would agree with. Only there are priorities to be considered. And the priorities are people's quality of life against a tree. I'm sorry, as much as I love trees, I think there are definite priorities to consider here.
Can I ask you then, Ms McDougall, in terms of Margaret Mitchell's question round about trees which are covered by tree preservation orders, do you believe that trees covered by tree preservation orders, if they are causing some grief to someone, should also be levelled to? Actually, we are reasonably happy with Mark MacDonald's bill and what he says about tree preservation orders, because they are usually single trees. For a start, they're not a huge hedge. So really, we don't really have any problem.
Just goes into the mix. It's just another factor that has to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, I just would like to show you, though, one single tree, which is covered in ivy. It's a deciduous tree, and that acts completely, as a leaf-bearing tree, covered with ivy.
Margaret, do you want to come back?
No, that's fine.
Thank you. Anne McTaggart, please.
Thanks, Convener. Just really going back to the issue of fees, partially discussed earlier. And the financial memorandum to the bill includes an example of the projected costs associated with making the decisions on the applications for high-hedge notices to be imposed. The bill does not specify any upper limit or cap fees on local authorities to charge. There is a figure between £325 and £500 has been suggested. Do you have any concerns or evidence that would show that this may prohibit for some individuals who have been involved in disputes?
Well done, Anne. I know how difficult that is with the voice. Ms McDougall.
Yes. I've taken a great interest in the fee side of this because I hear from so many of Scott Hedge members their fears about not being able to complain about their high hedge. And so we have definite proposals to make. We've looked at the Westminster and the other parts of the UK. And our first choice, actually, for justice sake, is to have no cost for the innocent party. And the loser, should pay the full costs at the end of the day. Of course, if a deposit is required, then to prevent malicious or vexatious complaints, then the complainer should be required to put up a fee, but should be returned, we feel, if the complaint is upheld. We know that justice in Scotland can be open to through the Small Claims Court, for example, and the fees for that, if you're claiming up to £5,000, is £65 to access the system. We totally recognise that there are other costs after that, but to access the system is only £65, and we don't think that hedge victims should be treated less favourably than any other victims. And although fees do vary quite a great deal in England, the average is roughly about £350. And in Wales, there's an upper limit, as you know, of £320, but in Northern Ireland, it's £360. So there is a wide variety. We would like it to be, as COSLA would, cost neutral. And this, we think, can happen. We've been told, in fact, in the documents that we've been given, that savings might actually accrue as a result of statutory procedures. So we think also that a statutory requirement that fees should be reduced on a concessionary level too. This is not in the bill. It's being given powers to local authorities to decide. But some councils charge on a sliding scale or make concessions or even of proof of mediation first. So there is a wide variety. But first and foremost, we don't think that justice should be could be served by having the complainant who has lived for years with this awful condition having to pay hundreds of pounds at the end of the day from people who, I have to say, most of them, because they are the victims, cannot afford it.
Do any of the other organisations want to contribute to that?
I think that was
Dr. Keegan.
Oh, sorry, I was going to say that was quite a point well made. My only thoughts on having a fee is what we will need if the bill was broadened out. We'd have to have people trained up to assess the biodiversity value of. So is the fee going to pay for the resources that the local authority are going to have to sort out these problems? And I can see why a fee is needed. I wouldn't necessarily say who should be paying it. I think there was a point well made there. So
okay,
that's all I've got to say.
Okay, John Pentland, please.
Thank you, Convener. This evidence session this morning sort of brings back to mind my just been newly elected as MSP for Motherwell Wishaw. One of my first surgery inquiries was actually on High-Hedges, and in the quality of life that Pamela McDougall highlighted there was obviously a real concern to my constituent. And but following on from that inquiry, I did write to Rosanna Cunningham asking when, if there were a bill probably going to come forward in respect of the High-Hedges legislation, and only to be informed by Rosanna Cunningham that a bill was pending. So I'm not too sure whether it was my question that pushed that or not, I don't know, but anyway, I'll take the credit for it, and so does my constituent. But anyway, I think my question is more about the appeals, and as you're probably aware, the bill does recognise that there is an appeals mechanism in that respect, and it identifies where an applicant with a high-hedge notice has, they can appeal to the council, and vice versa. The thing. But it's when an application has just been dismissed, and the applicant does not have there's no room for an appeal.
Could you maybe highlight, do you have any concerns about that?
Appeals. Scott Hedge, do you want to go first on this? Mr. Park?
Yeah, given the process that we're looking for, we have confidence in all the powers and the local authorities and the experts to make a correct decision. So if an appeal was dismissed, an appeal is dismissed. I think that has to be the end of it, as it is in Hull, unless we can go to the European Court or something, I'm not sure, but that would be the end of it as far as we would be concerned. And I don't think that holds any fears for us, and it is possible that there might be frivolous and vexatious claims. We're not holding a candle for every possible person that might want to use the process, so there's got to be some sanction. Fine.
Any of the other organisations wish to comment on that? Mr. Pentland?
No, that's fine.
Okay. John Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. And I make a declaration. I'm a member of the Scottish Wildlife Trust. I'm also a member of the RSPB and the Woodlands Trust. I also have a Leylandii hedge that may be more than 2 metres high in my garden. However, I don't think it impinges on any other neighbour's garden or property. The questions I would like to ask mainly concentrate on Scott Hedge, because the submission that you've made for evidence uses some fairly strong language to be in terms of you refer to people happy to abuse and victimise their neighbours, and you say it's a small number of people who are prepared to do that, and you also indicate that the law uniquely allows them to be used as weapons for that purpose. Now, the difficulty is that we talk about, and we have referred to, quality of life. What would you say if the members of Scott Hedge who are making complaints against their neighbours about having high hedges or trees that may impinge upon light blocking and various other aspects of their enjoyment of life, the people who have these hedges and trees say by removing these hedges and trees, it's actually taking away their enjoyment of their environment and something that they are content to live with. So how do you balance that against the complaint against a neighbour because they've got a high hedge, and the neighbour who then says, well, I enjoy my high hedge, I enjoy my tree, I've been here 50 years, I've grown this tree for that lengthy period, I've watched it develop and grow, and the wildlife that it attracts I feel is beneficial and good for my mental health, good for my well-being, and I think it's wrong to actually be asked to remove that tree or hedge because a neighbour who may have just moved in, or somebody who has not been there for that length of time, or in some of the examples we've heard earlier, has actually bought a house in a new estate that's been built in the last 5-10 years, as the Cumbernauld Glen example indicated. What would you say to individuals in those circumstances?
Mr. Park.
Yep, a lot of questions there, John, if you'll
bear
with me.
You've raised a lot of questions.
I better declare an interest as well. I'm actually, as I said to Aidan, I'm actually a fellow of the RSPB as well. So, you know, we're looking at specific circumstances here. You mentioned about the language we used in our submission. Yes, it's strong because it's passionate and it's you know, we really believe in what we're trying to do. The thing about weapons may be slightly strong, but I'll give you some examples. The classic is the brick wall. You're not allowed to build a 30-foot brick wall to upset your neighbour, but you are allowed to grow a 30-foot tree, and at the moment there's no recourse to anything. A couple of examples, and this is quite a common one. Somebody may apply for an extension to a house, or usually a second-storey type extension that's going to have a detrimental impact either from light, view blocking or whatever on a neighbour. We have got cases, mine's one of them, where that planning permission was refused on the grounds of it's blocking the light and it's blocking the view. The planning permission was refused, the development couldn't go ahead, the extension building couldn't go ahead, but my neighbour's quite happily now cultivating dual rows of Leylandii and silver birch trees, knowing that whatever happens, he's still going to be able to punish my property. It wasn't even me. This was something I inherited from a previous owner. So there's one example. We have another fairly recent case, and I'm not going to tell you too much detail because there is violence and vindictiveness involved in this case. Somebody who has got a property designed to be eco-friendly. I'm not even going to tell you the reason why, but there was a dispute with the neighbour. The neighbour has now taken the opportunity to grow deciduous trees, knowing that that will take the sunlight off the eco-house and it will be rendered useless. That is a new type of case that we're starting to see. So those are examples of how people can be vindictive. Your question about, well, what about the guy who says, well, I enjoy my tree? We've just got to be proportional. You know, we never see, or well, we rarely see trees planted, grown high to the south of a property. People always want to have access for themselves to have south-facing or south light, you know, access to the light. But they'll quite happily grow them on the north side of their property and know that, well, I don't care. The neighbour suffers, but I'm okay. We quite often see that. We see trees planted to block views of other people in developments, but still maintain their own open aspect of a view. Other examples, we will see, and we get a lot of these sort of backland development cases where big houses sell off plots of land and little houses are put in. And then the big property will then think, oh, well, we can grow massive great trees around the border of our property, cut out all these little small properties that are our neighbours. But a big tree at the far end of a huge garden is maybe not an issue, but a big tree close to the on the boundary of a small property where there isn't a lot of garden can be actually very, very close to the actual building itself. So the issue here is proportionality. We've got to look when whoever's going to make the judgment. It's a balance. Whoever's going to make the judgment, one of the key things, and we cover this at some length in our publication, A Growing Problem, one of the key things is the proportionality. Is the effect it is having on neighbour A, or the benefit it is having for neighbour A, wildly out of proportion to the detriment that it's having on neighbour B? So every case, we're back to what we say. Let's have a good, robust, rigid process, and then we can make these judgments.
Clarify a point that you made, Mr. Park, because you said early on in that reply to Mr. Wilson that planning authority took into consideration lack of light, but you also said lack of view or removing the view. It's my understanding that planning authorities don't take view into consideration.
That's not what I've been told regarding my particular case, but as I say, it wasn't me personally. I bought the house for somebody else. But I will accept your point. Perhaps they don't. That is why we need to go back to the reasonable enjoyment of a property definition, I think.
Dr. Keegan.
I was just going to say, with regard to view, we have a case. We have a Southwick Coastal Reserve there, which is a SSSI, so a nationally designated site. And one of the neighbours said that some of the trees are blocking his view of the Solway Firth. So we worked as we could, and we've taken out some of the hedge-like aspen trees, but we have native oak trees there that have been there, for a couple of 100 years and are part of the definition of the SSSI. And so we don't want to take those out. And I'm just wondering what would happen if this came in and talked about views as well.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. This is the issue that I'm trying to get to in terms of how areas move on, and we see major housing developments taking place throughout central Scotland. And some of the examples, and I think the Cumbernauld Glen example is a good example, whereby a developer comes along, builds houses, encroaches, and I know that in certain areas some communities feel they're being encroached upon because of the developments that are taking place. But the communities, the existing communities, have built up trees and other shrubs and hedges for that community, but then the developer comes along. How do you then, as a trying to get to, measure the value of the individuals who have lived in that area, who have grown those trees, and the development that comes along where somebody moves in and says, my view is being obstructed, I don't like the trees, therefore I want those trees removed as soon as I move in, and then start taking out orders under this proposed bill. Would that be seen as frivolous and vexatious?
I'm going to take Mr. Yarwood first and then Ms. McDougall.
So there's a couple of points there. One is that I have other examples of developers having developed on particularly historic houses and as they've been sold off, so that there are plenty of those examples. I was going to say that we ought to come to it, Dan, because he is a planner, so he might be able to answer the question around views. And the other thing I was going to say was that we also have to remember in all of this, if we go back to the football diagram, then actually between us all, we are all of the view that we can deal with the majority of the hedge problems which are being discussed here, and that we are quite narrowly focusing on just some of the deciduous trees here.
On that issue, Mr. Yarwood, I know that you may be agreed on the hedges issues, but there's clearly within this bill and within the Scott Hedge paper, they are talking about trees as well, and appropriate tree growth, and they make reference to about blocking light from trees as well as the leaf litter that's caused by other trees. So the Scott Hedge submission is much wider than just the hedges.
So I was just wanting to point out that it is quite a narrow area, but with all the things we have discussed, and I absolutely agree, in terms of when a property has been built in relation to when trees have already been there, and there are lots of examples around developments being built close to fairly young trees, and we've talked about oak, but there are other examples which over many years will grow to a bigger size. And you have to appreciate, with native and with deciduous trees, the process that they go through in terms of maturing into a large tree and then falling back into as the tree dies over the years. Those dimensions are often not included in planning considerations.
Ms. McDougall and then Mr. Smith, please.
Just a brief point. Mr. Wilson said, I think, cutting trees down. I hope you don't mean cutting them out. Were you meaning bringing them down? It's just slightly ambiguous, that.
But no, it's not. In terms of Dr. Keegan's earlier evidence, she indicated that some trees, if you cut them too far, then you actually kill the tree off. So there is a potential loss of the tree by cutting it too far. And we have issues in terms of what type of tree it is and how far you wish to cut that tree down. And if we're going for a 2-metre height, and some older trees, then taking them down to a 2-metre height would actually decimate that tree and decimate the wildlife in that area that uses that tree as well.
I would say that the tree officers do have a lot of expertise in this matter, and that we do have a lot of trust in the tree officers.
It refers to Margaret Mitchell's earlier comment that sometimes the TPOs are completely ignored. And people do cut down trees and then say,
we're not concerned about the TPOs at all.
Okay.
Sorry, Derek.
Mr. Smith.
Yeah, if it's helpful, I can provide a bit of confirmation on how the planning system deals with views and impacts on light, because I'm a former, for my sins, local authority development control officer. So for the committee's and everybody else's benefit, effect of light on a private property would be a planning matter. The effect on a private view wouldn't be a planning matter, but the effect on a public view would be a planning matter. So hopefully
thank you
that's
for
helpful.
that clarification, Mr. Smith. Mr. Park, you were wanting to come in.
I was really only just going to go back just very briefly to the thing about the danger of killing a tree and just make the point that if we put something in that, as they have done down south, that says the deal's off if there's any risk, so I think is what you said of it killing a tree, it's not a good place to go, and I think it's particularly unfair in Scotland, where we've waited since the start of the Scottish Parliament for this, and things have grown on another 12 years or however long it is. And in a way, that rewards the worst cases. Just because people have failed to do the decent thing and control their shrubs, trees, hedges, whatever it is, shouldn't then make it, a kind of, there's a way out because there's a risk of killing the tree. And I know even some tree surgeons down south are loath to get involved because of the local authority trying to take them to carry the risk.
Can I just clarify, Mr. Park, you're content that if there was any risk to a tree being killed off in terms of the actions proposed under the High-Hedges bill, that you're content that that tree should not be touched?
No, quite the opposite. No, we would say that that isn't really of any relevance. If the tree is considered to be causing the concern and the nuisance that it is judged to do, then the remedial work will be done, and if it kills the tree, I'm afraid it kills the tree. People are more important, and if that's the way, that's what turns out. And it will happen. I'm sure a qualified tree surgeon will occasionally work on a tree, and the consequence will be disease, and it will kill it.
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Park. Can I move on slightly, Convener? Because there is another issue for me, and that is the timing that any remedial action takes place, because we have had submissions and from the RSPB and others that indicate that the timing of when you take the remedial action to chop down trees or hedges may have an adverse impact into the wildlife that's currently using that. Would Scott Hedge be content that any remedial action should take place out with the breeding season of any wildlife in those that uses that habitat?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
No problem at all.
Right.
Thank you. Do any other members of the committee want to come back in? In which case, Mr. McMillan.
It's just one that's just regarding the borders within local authorities. If there was a situation whereby there was a tree or a hedge in the garden of one house in local authority X, but the way to get to it, the neighbour in local authority Y was adversely affected. How do you think this proposed legislation would actually deal with that type of example?
Any opinions on that? That's a complicated question for everyone, bar the former Development Control Officer, probably.
Our answer to that is we rely on you experts to solve that problem for us. I don't think it should, but on a serious note, I don't think it should preclude action being taken.
Mr. Smith?
Well, if it was an issue where a planning application was being submitted and applied for, there would be a requirement to consult with neighbours across the boundary, whether there was a local authority boundary there or not. But the planning application would go to the authority in which the development was happening. So I guess the way that this bill would work would be similar, in that the authority in which the tree or the hedge was being dealt with was situated would be the lead authority on it, but there would need to be some scope for cross-border cooperation, I would think.
Thank you very much. I bet you didn't expect all of these planning questions today, Mr. Smith. Mr. MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. I'm having slight flashbacks to days on the Resources Management Committee of Aberdeen City Council there, but happy ones, you'll be pleased to know. Just two questions, if I may, Convener. One is around the Isle of Man example, which Stuart McMillan raised. My understanding from the Isle of Man government is that they are seeing difficulties arising in terms of enforcement around the specific area of deciduous trees and shrubs as part of that legislation, and I just wonder if we could get sort of general comment from the panellists around whether they would see complexity arising and difficulties of enforcement arising were the bill to be broadened out, and how they would see those maybe playing out.
We'll go from left to right. Mr. Yarwood first, please.
I'm just thinking additional points to the ones I've already made. I mean, I think it does. I can see why that they would be getting into that position, particularly if they're having to weigh up all of the different benefits of the trees that are there. And I think I don't know what the Isle of Man guidance is like for their tree officers, so it's difficult to comment without knowing quite the depth that they've gone to. It may be possible that I suppose I'm thinking a little bit from the other side of the fence, as it were. That actually, if you've got very clear guidance that is easy to follow, then it may well be that they're able to decide, well, actually, maybe they could tighten it up, is what I'm getting at. Maybe there are ways around that. I don't know without having looked at it, I'm afraid. It's hard to say.
Mr. Smith?
Well, I'm conscious, again, from a previous experience of working in development control, that definitions are often very challenging. And although it wasn't a major area of my work, working with tree preservation orders, for instance, getting into debates and discussions about when is a tree and things like that can be quite difficult. So as we've already discussed, getting the definitions right is quite important. And I think the relatively simple and clear definitions that are there at the moment are quite useful. Just go back to what I've previously said, if that was to be broadened out, I think that would be more onerous and require a fair bit more work to try and assess each individual case.
Dr. Keegan.
Yes, I was just going to say I could imagine there'd be difficulties with the biodiversity value. If you had a scoring system for a tree, then you'd have to have an expert in to decide, and there could be disputes over that. And I have seen cases before where, there's been a nest in a tree or a nest somewhere and it's not there anymore. Just saying, unintended consequences of things do happen.
Mr. Park.
Yeah, the Isle of Man case, just for people that perhaps aren't familiar, is a complicated case because it's a layered set of hedges, if you like, and there are also ground elevation changes and all this. So it is a complicated case. The judgment that was made there was that the case hinged on light was to, if you like, almost do a gradient across the hedges so that there was the sun and the sun could get in, so the hedges nearer to the property that was affected obviously was short, and then as it went further back, it was higher, giving privacy to the hedge grower. No problem with that, but the complainer appealed because his view was, everything should be down to 2 metres. There's a point there that came up before. Nobody's saying that everything should be down to 2 metres anyway. An appropriate judgment might be 3.5 metres or whatever. But in that case, it was appealed because if you like, the complainer was under the impression that it should have been down to 2 metres. And that was why it went to appeal. And it was actually thrown out, and the gradient sort of was established, and we agree with that. This case, though, was a complicated case, but it wasn't complicated because it was involving deciduous species. That actually is by the by, they were just trees. It was nothing to do with species. It was all to do with the arrangement and the gradient and the different ground levels. So I don't really think the Isle of Man case has much relevance.
Ms. McDougall, do you want to add to that?
I would obviously support everything Mr. Park said there. And just to say that, new bills bring up strange and difficult cases. I'm sure they do. And that was one of them, but only one.
Mr. MacDonald?
Yep, a couple of questions around the fees issue, if I may, Convener. The first of which is, obviously, Dr. Keegan, Mr. Smith and Mr. Yarwood have spoken about the biodiversity assessments and further assessments that would be required were deciduous trees to be included, and I wonder if perhaps they might like to comment on whether they would see that as having an impact in terms of the costs to the authority and subsequently the fees that would be levied being much higher than perhaps might otherwise be the case under the current definition.
Dr. Keegan?
Well, it would be if you have somebody who doesn't know a lot about biodiversity, because they're going to have a lot of training too. I mean, as I say, I used to do bat survey work when I was a consultant, and that's quite a specialist job. It's not something you can do in a couple of hours to learn how to do it. So otherwise you're going to have to get in a bat specialist to have a look and pay them to carry out the survey work.
Mr. Smith?
Yes. I should point out that in our submission we suggested that biodiversity should be considered under the current proposals as well. So, but given that the current proposals have got that quite tight definition, which would only cover species which are generally of lower biodiversity value, if it were to be broadened out, there would have to be that additional assessment of the biodiversity value. So yes, potentially it could result in a bit more work if the definition were to be widened out.
Mr. Yarwood.
And I'd add to that biodiversity officers and tree officers in local authorities have been hard hit over the last 5-6 years or so in terms of numbers. I know and certainly Fife, for example, has one part-time tree officer Edinburgh, I think I'm right in saying that they've gone from 4 or 5 members of staff in their tree officer group down to 2 or 2.5. So this is quite common across the whole of Scotland with the economic climate. So if you are having to upskill and to provide extra training for biodiversity or for tree survey work, then that is undoubtedly going to have an impact.
Mr. MacDonald.
Well, I see Mr. Park wants
Mr.
to
Park.
respond.
Just a comment. And we've always said with this bill we kind of are where we are, so I am backtracking a little bit on to some earlier proposals. In Wales, there is a central tree officer, or whatever you want to call it, you know, a core of expertise that looks after the whole of Wales. We actually have advocated in the past that that's a possibility for Scotland, so we pool the expertise and make it available to all the local authorities.
Mr. MacDonald.
And my second question, which is probably more directed towards Scott-Hedges, that in the evidence today you spoke about if taking myself and Mr. Stevenson as an example, if I apply for Mr. Stevenson to deal with his high hedge, which is affecting my enjoyment of property, and it finds in my favour that Mr. Stevenson has to do so, the fee that I pay is reimbursed and the cost is then recovered from Mr. Stevenson. I just wonder around how you would go about recovering that cost and what the potential cost benefit would be of a local authority pursuing Mr. Stevenson for the fee, comparative to the cost of pursuing him.
Mr. Park. Ms. McDougall.
As far as the recovery of fees are concerned, if this is what you're talking about, it would surely be, as you have proposed anyway in the bill. I don't see any difference in the recovery of monies from the loser.
Yeah, I'll try and explain it a bit better in terms of there is a mechanism within the bill to recover costs where the authority undertakes work. If, however, that doesn't happen, I'm simply looking at it from the proportionality of the cost to the authority of pursuing Mr. Stevenson for the fee, in terms of how much it might cost them to pursue him compared to the money they would actually receive back.
If that's prohibitive, then obviously there'd be no point in doing it. But I think the key thing is that the complainer whose complaint is upheld shouldn't suffer if it proves impractical to recover it. We've never looked to punish people here. We've never gone out to try and make people wrong and get back at people and punish people. That's not what we're after. We're looking to protect the interests of the people who suffer. We're not looking to punish the people who we would say cause the suffering.
Mr. MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. That's all I have.
Okay. I wasn't going to let the committee come back in, but if folk have got very brief questions, I will. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. It's just really to get clarification from Mr. Park. You made reference in a response to Mark MacDonald about the Isle of Man case and about the height of whether it be 2 metres or 3.5 metres, depending on what would be classified as a barrier to light for the neighbour. Now, the bill quite specifically says that the Act applies in relation to a hedge, and it refers to the hedge, but in Part 1.1b, rises to a height of more than 2 metres above ground level. So, can I clarify from Mr. Park, would you be content if an officer of the council came along and said that we do not accept that 2 metres is the height that we should be looking at, that it could potentially be 3 metres or 3.5 metres high, rather than this blanket enforcement of a 2 metre high hedge?
Yeah, I think we've just got to be careful not to confuse what is a trigger height for initiating the process with the findings of the process. I absolutely accept that in an appropriate circumstance, 3 metres might be appropriate. In my case, about 4 metres would do me, to be perfectly honest. But not 5.5, or 7, which is where the trees are now.
Thank Mr. Park for that clarification.
Margaret Mitchell.
Yes, I just wondered the panel's thoughts on the justification for a single tree not being included in the legislation or covered by the legislation.
Ms. McDougall first, please.
Sorry,
a single tree not being covered
why we want?
Just a justification.
Because, well, this demonstrates it. I mean, that's just one single tree. And it's, this is our tree, actually.
Trying to get all the panels kind of feedback on that. Yeah.
But a single tree can keep out as much light as a row of 2 or 3 trees in a hedge. I mean, that's the point.
I agree.
Mr. Park.
Nothing really, Chad, but we do have other cases where single trees are very, very close because of narrow driveways and things, very, very close to neighbouring properties. Would be a shame not to sweep them up, if you like, into the same legislation.
Dr. Keegan.
I was just going to say, again, it's a question of having the appropriate tree in the appropriate place, really.
Yeah. Mr. Smith?
Just go back to my previous point about the benefits of keeping the definition narrow and tight, but other than that, not necessarily any in-principle opposition to it being extended, provided these other safeguards are in place.
Mr. Yarwood.
I think picking up partly on John Wilson's point about how trees are viewed by different people as to whether they're causing a problem or they're causing a pleasure, and then the issues around age and whether or not the problem has arisen after a tree has been established, or whether or not they have been the problems have been arisen because a tree has been established and is young and is growing quickly, and going back to the historic and cultural value of them.
Okay, thank you. Nobody else has caught my eye, so can I thank you all very much for your evidence today, and can I suspend the meeting for 5 minutes and we move into private session? Thank you.